Today we have Jim Ike's presentation on wetland awareness, Paula Bagley and Jerry Lewis from New York, who will be doing a presentation on construction materials and quality assurance, Darren Davis from Massachusetts, who will be doing a presentation on working with landowners and farmers, and then I'll be wrapping it up for your final comments. So I will let each presenter introduce themselves more fully at the start of their sessions. Please feel free to use the chat functions to ask any questions and answer any questions. We will be monitoring these for the presenters and we'll ask them at the time. Let me see, and I think that's about it. So today our first speaker is Jim Eikenberry. He is the wetland specialist in Vermont.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to sort of be cyber teaching you all. So again, I'm Jim Eikenberry. I'm the wetland specialist for Vermont, and I've been in the agency for about almost 15 years now and seen a lot of things and excited to have lots of new staff on board and want to make sure that you all have awareness of wetlands and what your roles and responsibilities are in your job in relation to wetlands. So without further ado, we'll roll into the presentation. I am monitoring the chat, so feel free to pop up any questions you have there. And then we are going to have some, we'll call it attempts at interactivity. I've found with some of these online trainings that can be a little hard to pull off, but we're going to give it our best. So let's get right into it. So, the first question really is, what are wetlands? If somebody hasn't had lots of experience with them, they might have a visual idea of what wetlands are. From a parameter standpoint, we've got three main parameters that we evaluate and consider when we're seeing if something is a wetland or not. Wetlands hydrology, hydric soils, and hydrophytic plants. So there are lots of different definitions for wetlands and for these factors. Some are legal, some are purely scientific, some are a mixture of the two. We're going to get into some that are basically our Food Security Act definitions. They're not the only definitions, but they're sort of the easiest ones that we have to hand and ones that we use fairly frequently. But do bear in mind that there are slight variations in definitions of wetlands hydrology, hydrophytic plants, and hydric soils, especially when it comes from a legal standpoint. So wetlands hydrology, you guys can read the slide. The big picture is wetness and wetness at a certain time and wetness of a certain duration. Typically, you're looking at least 14 days of saturation or inundation in the early part of a growing season to really qualify as wetlands hydrology. And there's a lot of variability in hydrology, but it's really, the pattern over time that soil and that vegetation is experiencing. Hydric soils, lots of good specific definitions on this, and this is our Food Security Act one. Again, I'll let you read the slide, but the big picture is it's this soil, this substrate that in its undrained condition is, saturated, flooded, or ponded for, again, this long enough period of time to develop that anaerobic condition. Again, it typically at least 14 days in the early part of the growing season to, support hydrophytic vegetation. So you're already seeing definitions defining other elements of the factors that make up wetlands. That's typical in the world of wetlands because as much as we evaluate the three different parameters separately, they're all very intertwined. Hydrophytic vegetation. So again, I'll let you all read the definition. This is a picture of a tussock sedge, which is a plant that has adapted to living in wet places by quite literally growing its own little tussock and little mound to try to get a little bit drier. And that's, part of its evolutionary adaptation. But the plants that you're typically finding in wetlands have many different adaptations for growing in these very wet conditions, and they're able to be competitive, whereas, more upland plants don't compete as well in the wetter conditions and thus aren't thriving and are not found as frequently in the wetlands. So again, hydric soils, wetlands hydrology, and hydrophytic vegetation are all key components that are coming together to make something a wetland. So one of the reasons why we're even having this discussion, it's not just because wetlands are cool, which for the few of you that are on this call who know me well, you'll know that that's definitely how I feel about it. But, we've got legal reasons why we need to consider wetlands. As I'm sure the past few days have shown you, everything is flowing from law or statute and then regulation and policy. And so, NRCS Wetlands Protection Policy is no different. And this is something that will, inform and affect you every single day that you work for NRCS. So that's one of the key reasons why you're getting this training, so that you don't, sail forth early in your career and not consider wetlands when you're legally mandated to do so. So there's a whole lot of different reasons why. One of the biggest ones is the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. There's certain requirements in there. There's an Executive Order 11990 from the Carter era that is still on the books and still in effect about making sure that federal agencies are considering wetlands in our activities. Clean Water Act, and then there's other federal, state, tribal, and local laws which may also provide protection of wetlands that you need to be aware about in your work area. And then the NRCS Wetlands Protection Policy is also codified in the NRCS General Manual. So, from the General Manual, I will read this verbatim for you all. NRCS will consider protection of wetland functions to the maximum extent practicable when implementing planning and program activities, including when providing technical and financial assistance. So basically, pretty much everything you're doing as an NRCS employee has in the background your requirement to consider protection of wetland functions to the maximum extent practicable. So keywords that I'm going to, really make sure that you all look at and, key in on are wetland functions and the word practicable. That's a very important word that you'll experience many times in your NRCS career because there are certain situations where it might not be practicable to protect wetland functions, and you might need to take some other approach in order to still install an important conservation practice that will have environmental benefit. And providing technical and financial assistance really covers the gamut of what we're doing. So one can't go out as a government employee in your role and start recommending willy-nilly that somebody start destroying wetlands. That's not appropriate action, and that's not lawful. So bear in mind that this is a requirement, and it should inform your actions. So wetland functions was a key part of what we had looked at before. There are lots of different ways about thinking about wetland functions. Oftentimes people talk about functions and values, but when we look at our policy, we're talking about wetland functions. So it didn't talk about wetland values. So our focus is going to be on functions. There we go. So floodwater retention is a typical function that people think about in wetlands. That's classic with a floodplain wetland along some river or stream that gets a lot of its wetlands hydrology from annual flooding events. Sediment retention and nutrient removal are very related to those situations as well, typically with a floodwater wetland because there's surface roughness with the vegetation in those sites, and therefore they're slowing down some of that water, which in turn can trap sediment, and with that, retain and at times, through biogeochemical processes, remove nutrients from that water. Shoreline stabilization is a major one that, with the recent hurricanes is particularly important to think about. There's a lot of coastal wetlands, especially in the southeast, that have a very important function in stabilizing shoreline and protecting from hurricane damage. It's also a major issue for lakes, and small ponds as well. So shoreline stabilization is a major factor, and depending on the region of the country that you're in, it might be a particularly critical factor that you might encounter in your career. Fish and wildlife habitat is really, throughout the nation, you're going to be encountering wetlands providing fish and wildlife habitat. Depending on where you are, they can be really, really critical habitat areas that provide unique elements for life cycles for many species. We think a lot about vernal pools here in the Northeast and throughout the East, that they're, a real powerhouse of both sort of nutrient and energy, and as well as critter distribution throughout the Northeast woods. Lots of rare, threatened, and endangered species are dependent on wetlands for at least part of their life cycles. Many migratory birds need wetlands as stopover locations to, forage, rest, and then carry on in their journey. So that's a major factor, that almost every wetland you encounter might have some element of fish and wildlife habitat. Groundwater recharge and carbon sequestration are, very important factors as well, and things that we might not automatically think about, but that are worth considering. And in particular, it might depend on the type of wetland you're encountering, where they might be more important factors. So if you're in some kind of a, critical ground headwater situation in a watershed, the groundwater recharge, might be particularly important. Also very soils dependent. So there are other wetland functions out there. These are key ones that will likely come up and that may need evaluation from you or from some other qualified NRCS biologist or wetland specialist or resource conservationist who can evaluate if the project you're planning to do might impact wetland functions like these. So when do we identify wetlands? I'll break this up in three main ways that most people experience wetland identification in their NRCS career. So one major way that everybody should be experiencing it is during the resource inventory step of our conservation planning process. This is typically using off-site data such as soils mapping, wetlands mapping, either national wetland inventory or some state or local resources. So that should be, part of the conservation planning process, is considering, are there wetlands mapped at a site, and if so, how does that impact or not, the alternatives that I'm going to suggest to the landowner and practices that NRCS could potentially, give technical or financial assistance on. Another major way that doesn't impact everybody directly, but certainly is a major factor for our customers, and for some of us, it's 50% or more of what we do on a daily basis. When conducting official Food Security Act wetland delineations and determinations. So the delineation is going out and seeing, if there's a wetland there, and if there is, what is the boundary of that wetland? And then the determination is putting the appropriate USDA Food Security Act label on that wetland, which is based off of land use history, agricultural cropping history, and many other factors. And then another one that I didn't want to omit, because it's the other half of my job, involving the ASEP WRE program, where we do wetlands restoration and permanent conservation easements to restore wetlands that have been agriculturally impacted, typically hydrologically, and permanently protect and restore them to maximize wildlife habitat. It's a very exciting program. In some states, it is a major program that everybody's aware about. Others, not as much. But I would encourage you that if you do not know much about our wetlands reserve easements, that you find an opportunity to do so and to at least get out and see one, if at all possible. It's an exciting part of the work that we do, and it's permanent conservation and wetlands restoration for wildlife habitat. And, properly delineating wetlands is the key part of that. And then, evaluating the success of wetlands restoration can involve follow-up delineation work as well. So wetlands are very much a part of who we are and what we do at NRCS. The main way during your conservation planning that you're going to interact with a lot of, potential wetlands information is really with that off-site data. So soils mapping, hydric soils, Soil Survey Water Features reports, National State Wetland Inventories, and you can read the rest on the list. Also, for the states that have them, the ecological site descriptions, those can be very helpful at a large scale as far as, looking at a site. If you're zooming into just a few acres, you're going to need some finer detailed information. But don't be afraid to use an auger or a shovel and dig a hole and look at the soil. That, I think, is one of the most important things that you can do early on in your career. It's fine to trust the soils map, but keep in mind the scale that the mapping is at and the region of the country you're in will impact the accuracy of what you find in that particular spot where you're digging a hole. So there's the WHOLE, the hole, which is that larger unit, and then there's the hole, HOLE, where you're digging in particular. So there's variety in soil, and I would encourage you to, take a look at it when you're out there and get to know the soils in your area. That's one of the smartest things that you can do early on in your career. Find opportunities to partner with soil scientists and to get that higher level technical knowledge and learn from them. That will only make you a better conservationist, and you'll also start to see things on the landscape or know when to say, hey, this wasn't mapped as a wetland, but I think we might have one here. And we'll get into some slides on that in a little bit that will help you because because you've got offsite data that says one thing, you are the professional and you are the observer. If you get on land and you see something different, you need to use that information to make good decisions. So that on-site field investigation, we're identifying and quantifying vegetation, documenting the hydrology or hydrology indicators, depending on the time of year that you're out there, and then describing the soils. So this is an opportunity, I hope, for folks to, get into the chat and, add some of their thoughts. If I don't see much activity in the chat, I'll keep going on. I won't be offended. I know it's early and this is your last day, so thanks everybody for sticking with me. So potential signs of wetlands in the field. You need to go out in the field and you need to look at the land and you need to have your eyes open and you need to not rush. You need to take time and you need to really look around. And ideally, you can go to a site more than once and you can do it at different times of the year so that you can really do the best conservation planning that you can do. So things to think about. Is an area different from its surrounding? What makes it different? So on the left here, what we've got illustrated is some wetter soils. They've got some skunk cabbage coming up, which is, an obligate wetland plant, so it tends to only grow in wetlands, very much, early emerging in the spring, no other woody vegetation. So, this is an early spring photo, and you can see, hey, this site is wetter, and what's going on here? And another thing to think about is the farmer treating this area differently? That's oftentimes a clue as to what's going on and that it might be a wetter area. So ponding and crop failure, if you go out in August and you see a cornfield and half of it looks beautiful and the corn is 8 feet tall, and then the rest of it, has 2 foot tall corn that is, very yellow and very sad and, doesn't have the same rate of seed catch as the tall, healthy corn, that's another clue. I've got photos of cornfields that have huge patches of cattails growing in them in the wetland location. So, just open your eyes, look around, and spend time and think about things and think, why isn't the farmer farming that? Or why is that all grass instead of corn? What's going on out here? Another thing to think about in this, location, even though you've got a slope, you can have wetlands on slopes, particularly in the east and the northeast, in the areas where we've been glaciated. It is oftentimes unsurprising to find wetlands on slopes. So bear that in mind, that you might have some area that, it seems steeper. How could the water possibly hang around here long enough to be wet? But there's potential, especially if you're under 5% slope, between 0 to 5%, and certainly 0 to 3%. And if it's a concave shape and not a convex shape, there's definitely potential depending on the texture of the soils. So again, see what the farmer is doing, see what if there's a grazed area, see what the cattle or other, critters are or are not eating. Unless you've got a high density of ravenous goats out there, there's a lot of less palatable wetland species that will not be consumed unless the animals are really, really desperate. So, think again, why is this area different and what makes it different? Another example is, cluing in on certain species as well. Reed canary grass, sort of the bane of my existence from a wetlands restoration standpoint, but people put it on the land for a reason, and all the different cultivars are out there for a reason, because it was able to grow in really wet areas, and they were able to get, consistent crop from it. And so, they graze it when it's young and, get fairly good quality hay off of it before it gets too woody early on in the season. So see what plants are growing there. Why is the farmer avoiding it? What's going on? This is an odd spot in the field. It might be a wetland, and it might not be an appropriate spot to put certain conservation practices, or it might be depending on the factors that are out there. So I gave a training on our NEPA process and the CPA 52 document earlier this week, and that really informed my thinking on how I was going to present this training, because, it's one thing to be told you need to consider this factor. It's a whole other thing to be, okay, how do I consider this factor? So I want to give you that information as well. Not only do you know now that you need to consider wetlands in your technical and financial work, which is everything that you're doing, but how do you go about doing it? So on the CPA 52 environmental evaluation form, there is a section specifically relating to wetlands where you would note what is happening in the no action alternative, and then in any of the alternatives that you are proposing that the landowner has already chosen to do. Related to that are these wonderful, wonderful, wonderful documents that as a new planner you really should look at for all those special environmental considerations and factors. And they are environmental evaluation guide sheets. And you should be able to find them in that Excel document. If you can't, you should be able to find them, on the environmental, websites or SharePoint sites. If you can't find them, talk to your state biologist, your district conservationist, whomever. If that fails, talk to me. I'll get them to you. These guide sheets will help you become a better planner. And one of the best ways to think about them is all the people who retired before you even got hired were thinking about you. And they were really worried that the things that they knew they couldn't pass on to you because they would never meet you. And so a lot of effort was put in writing things down, creating forms and flow and documents to help you know what they know. And a lot of that is informed by these guide sheets, because it's critically important from a legal standpoint that you do this part of your job correctly. So use the guide sheets when you're doing planning. It will make you a better planner, and it will help you to understand things that at a certain point you might inherently just get and know and understand and process. Early on, using the guide sheets will help you do things correctly. And for the government, you need to document things. You just can't say, oh, I knew it wasn't a wetland, and so we put the manure pit there. Really? How do we know that you knew it wasn't a wetland? How did you document that? Where's the evidence? You've got to have proof. So the guide sheet is also excellent documentation that you followed the process and that you came to appropriate conclusions and that your actions were not arbitrary and capricious. You were following the process, giving fair and equitable treatment to your customer. So the first question in step one is, are wetlands present in or near the planning area? And, it doesn't require you to do an intensive wetland delineation of every single site. This is really based off of your observations and the off-site data that's available. And it includes all wetlands, which is a little bit different from our Food Security Act work. So there could be prior converted wetlands out there. And if they're meeting, wetland criteria, then you would need to consider them. And in certain situations, which they're saying non-irrigation induced artificial wetlands, which retain wetland characteristics, they need to be considered as well. So that's a little bit different than our Food Security Act work, where we might not be worried about certain types of wetlands. So do bear that in mind. But if the answer is no, then it's very simple. I looked at all the data, there were no wetlands present, I check no, I'm done with the guide sheet. I would document on my CPA 52 form, no wetlands present, and I'd carry on. But that's still me following the process. And so if yes, then you would move on to step 2. So step 2, will the action impact any wetland areas? This includes changing wetland types when considering wetland restoration projects. So this is a really critical one to think about, and this is where wetland functions really come in. And if one isn't qualified, then you need to get somebody who is qualified to help you assess wetland functions. And each state might do that differently. But again, look to your district conservationist or your state biologist or wetland specialist or however your state is organized to give you guidance on who you need to talk to assess wetland function to see if you're going to have an impact. So will the action impact any wetland areas? So it could be that there are wetlands present in your planning area, but the things that you're offering, as alternatives aren't going to have an impact. Then again, it's no, document on the 52. Will the action impact any wetland areas? And then if yes, assess the wetland functions and describe the effects of the proposed activity on the wetland area. And this is a key thing. If the effects are solely beneficial, continue with planning. So, there could be ways where you've got an activity planned, but what you're planning is solely beneficial. There are wetlands present. I'm going to restore the wetlands, and it's going to be solely beneficial. Then you're good to go. You document that on the 52. There's also a situation here where if you've gone out with some qualified individual and they are noting that there are wetlands present, but those wetlands have been so really destroyed by the farmer and their farming activities, they don't have wetland functions. That there are some situations, and again, you need to have a qualified individual assist you with this, where you might check no, and because it's not going to impact wetland functions, the activity you've got planned. We'll get into a few photos of that in a little bit, but bear in mind this is a key area. Typically, though, you're going to encounter a wetland, and it will have wetland functions, and if you've got a practice plan that's going to impact it, you need to think about, well, how do we handle this? So the first step in our process, and it's very similar to pretty much every other wetland process that's out there, is trying to find practicable alternatives. And again, that keyword is practicable. So it's got to be reasonable. It's got to be in the financial capacity of the farmer to do. It can't be something that costs $1 billion to avoid the wetland. It needs to be a real practicable alternative. And does it exist that can avoid adverse impact? So the first thing we're going to do if we encounter wetlands is, can we avoid it? Can we shift that manure pit in a different direction so it doesn't go where the wetlands are? Does that animal trail have to run through this low wet spot, or can we move it over here? If you can avoid wetland impact, then that is exactly what you need to do. And this is an important thing here, too, that not everybody clues into as well as they should. If you can avoid, great. But if no, go to step 4. Oh, let me clue into one thing here, too. So you want to do that avoidance. If yes, advise the client of available alternatives. If the client chooses to implement the alternative that avoids adverse impact, including all necessary permits, document on the 52, and carry on. But look at this last sentence. Otherwise, NRCS shall terminate all assistance for the project. Now, this is specific to the alternative. You might have 30 different practices planned, but if they refuse to avoid, and avoidance is possible, NRCS will stop providing technical and financial assistance on that particular thing. And that's not just something that you should do because you feel like it. You're legally obligated to stop providing technical and financial assistance on an alternative that will have negative impacts to wetland functions that could completely be avoided. We are legally not going to be involved in that activity. There may be other activities on the farm that aren't going to impact wetlands that we can be involved in. But if the farmer is insistent that that animal trail has to go through that wetland, and it has to go through there, and we know that it's practicable to shift it 50 feet and totally avoid the wetland impact, we're not going to be involved in assisting them with that animal trail. Pardon me. So, but if there are no practicable alternatives to avoid wetland impacts, then you go to the next step, which is step 4. So, can you minimize impacts? If you couldn't 100% avoid those wetland impacts, if the manure pit, there's no way to shift it, you worked with the engineers, and it's got to impact some wetlands a little bit, but you weren't able to avoid all of it, but you could minimize it. I've had a situation that I always give up as my example for this situation where I worked with the engineers and the farmers. I was like, we've got wetlands here. This manure pit is huge, but is there some way that we can rotate this thing or shift it or move it so that instead of impacting a half acre of wetlands, we can get it down to just a few square feet? And the farmers wanted gravity so that they didn't have to deal with pumps, so that the manure would flow into the pit. The engineers had those constraints because that was a practicable thing, a factor we needed to consider. They're able to shift and rotate the manure pit to greatly reduce the amount of impact, to minimize. We got it down to just a couple thousand square feet of impact. That was following our planning process. That was working with what was practicable. We could not avoid, so we had to try minimization, and we were able to minimize. And so the answer was yes. We did the minimization, and the farmer accepted that scenario. If those farmers had insisted to stick with the original design and it couldn't go anywhere else but where they demanded that it would be, then we would have terminated all financial and technical assistance for that part of the project. We would not have been involved. If they were going to destroy wetlands that could have been minimized, then we're no longer involved, and that's a legal requirement. All right, so sometimes you can't minimize, although I find oftentimes one can. But in the rare circumstance where you could not avoid, you could not minimize, we have step 5. And this becomes a very, very, very complex step. Does the client wish to pursue an action that will result in adverse impacts to wetlands, and there are no practicable alternatives or minimization measures exist? So you can't avoid, you can't minimize. The only place for this manure pit to go is here, and there are wetland functions that will be impacted. So in this situation, you need to look at what we're calling mitigation or compensation. And so that is very much involved typically with the Army Corps of Engineers and oftentimes the state or local entities involved in a permitting process saying, the greater environmental benefit is installing this conservation practice here in this wetland. And unfortunately, we couldn't avoid wetlands impact. We couldn't minimize it. It's going to have an impact on wetland function. But we still think big picture, this is a better deal because the farmer has no manure storage, and now we're going to have manure storage, and there's a lot of benefits to that. What's going to be required then is some other wetland that they have is going to need to be restored, and protected in order to compensate and mitigate for the impacts that wetland project is going to have. So there are certain situations where NRCS legally can impact wetland functions, but you've got to go through the proper process, and you can't skip avoidance. You can't skip minimization. Compensation and mitigation should be a very rare occurrence in the last step, and you will find it very challenging and burdensome and likely involving lots of permits and lots of time. So focus on avoidance, focus on minimization, and on rare occasions you may need to have mitigation or compensation. So that's your overall flow. It tells you when to stop, when to document on the 52, and when NRCS might need to terminate assistance for that particular suite of practices involving wetlands if the landowner refuses to do the alternative that we legally can offer to them. Okay, so that was a lot. I want to go now into what is hopefully a more interactive mode. Again, I know it's early. This is your last day, so if people don't feel like, adding their thoughts to the chat, it'll be okay. But I at least want to expose you to some thoughts and to some common scenarios. And if I've learned anything in all my years at NRCS, is that NRCS folks love to talk about scenarios and to dream up, what about this? What about that? So we're going to go into that mode now using our knowledge that we have of wetlands. And in these situations, I'm going to talk about what information you have that helps you to know, is it a wetland or is it not? and then a planned activity. So this is a non-electrified fence installed at the edge of a wetland easement to keep people from going in there with their trucks and four-wheelers and destroying it. It has mapped hydric soils, it is mapped as frequently flooded soils, and it is mapped as wetland. And it is, in fact, in a state of restoration. So the activity we're planning is fence. So if we go back to our flow, and I'll just do that here to help us think about things. Step one, are wetlands present in or near the planning area? The answer to that one is yes. This is a wetlands easement. The whole focus is wetlands. They're there. Will the action impact any wetland areas? So, yep, we're going to put this practice in the wetlands. Is it going to be solely beneficial? In this situation, definitely. You know, the actual footprint of impact of each little post is not that big of a deal, and the major thing that's going to be happening is that we are going to keep harm from happening to that wetland. So if that is how I perceive that situation, I would check, yep, solely beneficial, I'm done. If I looked at it and I had some concerns and I thought, well, each individual little hole, maybe that's an issue, can I avoid wetlands impact? Well, maybe I could go down here and be like, okay, do I have practical alternatives that exist? What if I don't have my fence in the wetland? What if there's uplands right along the edge and I was able to shift my fence out of the wetlands up to the uplands? Yep, I was able to 100% avoid that by putting my fence in the uplands and not impacting them. So this one is a bit of a fuzzy example. I see it as solely beneficial and would take care of it earlier on. But if somebody saw it a little bit differently, you could still get to a very reasonable way of thinking about this practice and installing it, and know that you're doing good things for the wetland and not causing harm, and that cultural resources and other factors have been assessed. So another scenario to think about, and this is again, think about real world situations. This farmer, is doing no-till farming, and they want to really enhance the no-till farming with some cover cropping and then improved species cover cropping. The area is mapped as non-hydric soils, but the landscape position is at the bottom of a long slope. And when I go out there to do my resource inventory, I see that some parts of this area are saturated and ponded. So the gist of what I'm trying to communicate to you here is just because something isn't mapped as wetlands doesn't mean that it isn't a wetland. And I won't get too deep into the weeds on this one when you think about cover cropping and is it going to have a negative impact or a positive impact. I think it's very easy to go through our wetlands protection process, and even if this was some type of farmed wetland, if you are doing cover cropping and no-till, it's going to be less disturbance than the farmer going in there with a moldboard plow and tearing things up and potentially leading to erosion issues. And so I think, again, one could go through the process and be like, yep, there are wetlands here. They were not mapped. The practices that planned, are going to be solely beneficial. Bad things aren't going to be happening. But again, we've got to follow the process, and we've got to, check our instincts and to have somebody else take a look at what we thought. We're like, hey, you more experienced planner, what do you think? This is how I evaluated this. Is this on track? Another scenario, which is really trying to get at the concept of artificial wetlands that you need to think about as well. Because if they're not irrigation-induced artificial wetlands, then NRCS wetlands protection policy requires that you consider them. So this is a situation where the farmer, back in the day, dug this big hole to get some fill soils in these really heavy clay soils. And then they overgrazed the site, for 30 years. And it was a wet year when we were out there, and lo and behold, there's this wet site. So we evaluated it to see if it was wetlands or not. And again, going back to the beginning of our talk, wetlands hydrology, hydric soils, and hydrophytic vegetation were all those requirements in wetlands. Even though we had ponding here, the soils did not exhibit the technical criteria of hydric soils, and the vegetation was kind of a mixed bag, but was predominantly, upland or non-wetland vegetation. So what we were seeing was a spring condition that was very wet, but wasn't so wet to make it wetlands. But the fact when we were out there that there was this big ponded water, it made us concerned, and so we knew that we needed to evaluate this and see if it was an artificial wetland or not. Apologies for that. So again, observe, look around, pay attention, bring an auger with you, look at the soil, look at the plants. If you don't know, bring somebody with you who does know how to look at the soil or the plants. And that way you're going to do right by the farmer, because the last thing you want to do is get deep into a conservation planning process and then have found out the alternatives that you had offered and that they are excited about. It's not legally permissible for you to install them where you've planned. You do not want that. You do not want a contract that did not properly evaluate things, and that then somebody, from your area or state office was doing a quality assurance review and says, why are you putting this manure pit in this beautiful scrub shrub swamp? You don't want to encounter that situation. I've had to help people deal with those situations. That's the last thing you want. Do a good job with your resource inventory and your conservation planning, and that will lead to good contracts and good conservation implementation. Figure it out early on in the process. Don't wait until the day before you're going to sign the contract or the contract's already signed. You'll thank me for it. You'll have less grief in the long run. Another scenario here, and this is one that we just did a permit on. There's a waste storage facility. There was absolutely no other place for it to go, and we looked everywhere to see if there were alternatives, but we would have led to groundwater pollution, polluting the well, causing harm to the farm family and the small children that, are there. You name it. When you look at the soil, water, air, plants, animals, humans, energy, the only place to put this thing was to expand it into the wetlands. This wetland, though, had been so hammered and altered and impacted by the farming activities that it did not have wetland functions. So it was a situation where early on in the process, when we're documenting things in the CPA 52, we would actually say, no, there aren't going to be any impacts because there were not wetland functions remaining in the wetland. And so that's the key thing, is that if you've got something and it is a wetland, but if it's the most beat up wetland that has ever been seen because the farmer has so thoroughly destroyed it in their farming activities, it may be a situation where NRCS can work in there because you're not going to impact wetland function, which again gets back to some qualified person needs to assess the wetland function out there. So, just because you need to expand a manure pit and there's a wetland doesn't mean that the project's over. It means you need to follow the process and you need to have properly trained people evaluate those wetlands for wetland functions. So that was a lot of information, and again, early in the day, so I appreciate you all hanging on in there with me. Haven't seen anything popping up in the chat. This is a cute picture of a wood turtle. We do a lot of work trying to protect them and their habitat as we go, and just another reason why it's important to protect wetlands is there's a lot of species that are dependent on them. Big picture takeaways, think about wetlands in all of your technical and financial assistance activities. It is usually very easy to put on soils and wetlands layers and flooding layers and to get a quick offsite data view of where wetlands might be to help you inform your resource inventory and the alternatives that you suggest to farmers. So really use that offsite data to your advantage. If you get on-site and you see something that didn't show up on the mapping, but it sure looks like a wetland to you or has potential, dig into that soil yourself, look at those plants yourself, and then if you can't figure it out, ask for help. The big thing in NRCS, especially as a new employee, is you can feel like you are alone, especially in this remote environment. And you are not alone. There are people who their job is to support you and help you. So reach out to them and learn from them, and, you know, make sure that they give you that assistance that you need so you can do good planning and eventually, you know, have good contracts. So at this point, I'm going to, you know, stop talking, take a sip of water, and then if you've got questions, let me know.
Jim, there are questions in the chat. The first question is, in the last example, would we also try to improve wetland function?
Oh, sure. So a lot of it gets down to the alternatives that you're suggesting, the farmers' objectives, and then I'll add in there permitting requirements. So what we were able to do with this one was something that I was really proud of, that the farmers are really open-minded and they recognized that they were going to have impact. We worked with the state, who was the most involved permitting authority. The Corps of our engineers wasn't super concerned about this project once we got, you know, through their process and shared what we were doing. But the state wanted to see some level of mitigation. And it's certainly something that, you know, I would recommend in this situation, that you're impacting wetlands. They don't have function, but is there some other wetland on the farm somewhere that we could improve to still see about offsetting this? So they had a lot of really, really overgrazed wetland pasture right nearby. And so we worked with them to come up with a plan to put in some animal trail and walkways to greatly reduce the areas that they were going to be impacting with just cows everywhere. And so we really were able to concentrate and to get the animal traffic into some upland areas, so avoiding a lot of foot traffic and wetlands impacts there. And then we were able to fence, I think we got up to, I think it was 5 or 8 acres, so a significant area that they were willing to totally fence out. We were able to fence out a stream with it and a whole wetland complex. And then they're going to do tree and shrub planting with sort of a wetlands pollinator angle. So yes, see if there's some way that you can find to improve wetlands in those activities. Even when you aren't legally required to from an NRCS standpoint, try to find a way to have, you know, if you've got a willing landowner and it is practicable, definitely. And thank you for that good question. Yeah, I see stuff on the chat now that hadn't popped up before.
Okay, so next question. What are some examples of disproved wetlands? An area that looks wet but is not a wetland.
Oh, yeah. We'll go right back to this one. So, you know, this is where your observations are incredibly important. You can get to a situation, it's mapped as, you know, wetland, and it is mapped as hydric soils, and you get out there and it's not. A good example, our state wetland inventory has all these manure pits mapped as wetland. Sometimes it's an old pond that isn't entirely in an upland situation that wasn't a pond put in a wetland. Those could be some situations where it's disproved. This artificial or potential artificial wetland example is one where we got out there and we thought, ooh, is this an artificial wetland? But when we started looking at the soils, we're like, no, this is just kind of wet in the spring, but not for a period long enough and for a long enough, you know, standpoint to transform the soils to make it hydric soils and to have hydrophytic vegetation and wetlands hydrology. You could definitely see areas along the edge of fields in an upland situation where there's been a great deal of compaction over the years, and you might even see cattails growing in this stuff. But it's because the human impact on that soil is so compacted that it's created, you know, the appearance of some wetlands, but a lot of wetland plants are very, you know, willing to take advantage of situations where there's disturbed soils and compacted soils. So looking at those soils, you'd be like, wait a minute, you know, the chroma of these soils is so high, and this doesn't meet wetlands hydrology. It's just that these plants that could grow here did grow here, but it's not a wetland. So there's a lot of edges of fields, odd spots that have been dug out and impacted, areas sometimes around a barnyard complex that have just been hammered by farming activities. So again, you know, look at the off-site data, but when you're in a field on site, bring an auger, bring a shovel, dig around, look at things, and you might find something that this isn't a wetland at all. And we encounter that a lot in our Food Security Act determination work, where the soils mapping in some of our more forested and more remote parts of the state that nobody ever dreamed when they're mapping the soils that somebody would want to clear and farm. Somebody wants to clear and farm it now. And the scale of the soils mapping lumped this whole area as hydric soils, and then it got mapped as wetland because it was forested in the wetland inventory. But when we get in there, we actually find that there's non-wetland in there. So that is a sort of a fine scale way of looking at it. But there's lots of areas that might be noted as hydric soils or as wetland that aren't necessarily. The field investigation is required.
Next question, what are some of the specific wetland restoration practices that NRCS funds?
Sure. The wetland restoration practice itself is very all-encompassing. Some of the actual activities one might do would be plugging ditches, if ditches, were the main type of surface drainage on a site. If one had drainage tile on a site, it could be either plugging the outlets of that drainage tile if they are known, or going in and breaking apart drainage tile. Another kind of typical thing is, restoring wetlands, either macro topography or micro topography. So on the macro topography scale, if you're along some major river and it used to have all these oxbow wetlands on it, and then somebody drained them and filled them in and flattened them out, farmed them, could be restoring those larger oxbow type features in the restored wetland. We do a lot of microtopography work because a lot of wetlands, especially scrub, shrub, and forested wetlands, have what we call pit and mound topography. And typically when somebody, cleared that, stumped it, and farmed it, one of the first things they wanted to do was to level it and not have as much high bumps and low bumps because that's hard to farm. So a big part of restoration can be getting that topography back. Oftentimes it's just an excavator moving around, making high bumps and low bumps. We do a lot with coarse woody debris here in Vermont, and we're trying to do even more because the science is really pushing us towards that the more you can be installing, standing snags, down snags, small brush piles, you're really helping get the biology going again on the site that if you look at a reference wetland would have tons of standing and down dead logs, and in your 200-acre reed canary grass hayfield, there's nothing like that. Those are some quick things that come to mind.
Next question, no wetland, actually a comment, no wetland, no matter how degraded, have zero functions. That wetland still likely performs some water filtration function.
Comment accepted. I would say, make sure to work with your qualified person at NRCS to make sure that you're evaluating it the way that we have wetlands assessments available to function, to assess wetland functions.
Next question, what determines whether jurisdiction lies with the Army Corps or EPA?
Typically, the EPA delegates its authority for permitting processes to the Army Corps of Engineers. And so for most situations, one is dealing with the Army Corps of Engineers from a permitting process. When the Corps has a certain scale of project, and it depends on your Corps region, they will send it to the EPA for review, and the EPA has the legal authority to decide if it wants to get involved as well, and sometimes they do. Typically, it's more on the mitigation side of things and not an everyday Corps permit.
Okay, I think there was a question asked and answered. Is there a link to a collection of environmental guide sheets you mentioned? And then somebody answered, I believe the guide sheets mentioned are the ones within the CPA 52 Excel file.
That's correct, yep.
Okay, last question that I can find, 5,000 square feet of disturbance triggers Army Corps of Engineers, but sometimes smaller areas could be a trigger depending on the specific situation.
So that's getting at the general permits that the Army Corps of Engineers has. So it depends on the region that you're in, because oddly enough, permitting varies by region with the Army Corps of Engineers. So you need to be aware of the general permits that exist, and then they have different levels of permits. Some, if the impact is under a certain amount of square footage, is considered a non-reporting permit. So you wouldn't even need to notify them of the actions as long as you met all of their criteria of that permit. And then they have ones that over a certain threshold of square footage impact are considered reporting permits, where you need to make them aware of the project. They may require, notification before construction and notification after construction, and have the legal right to come out and take a look at it. And then after you exceed other thresholds, they're going to require that you, submit a permit application to go through a general permitting process. And then if the scale of a project is so great that it might require an individual permitting process, that becomes a whole entire different thing, where one might be required to look at every single piece of land that that landowner owns who wants to do a project, and they need to prove that there was no other way and no other land that they had that they could do a certain activity. So typically we're dealing with the general permits, and you need to be aware of the square footage thresholds in your area. And oftentimes our engineers are particularly clued into that because they're oftentimes very involved in the permitting process as well.
There was a confirmation that, yes, indeed, it was about the general permit. I have no other questions at the moment. So thank you, Jim. Enjoyed your presentation.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, so next up we have Paula Bagley and Jerry Lewis, both from New York. They're engineers, and they're going to be discussing construction materials and quality assurance.
My name is Paula Bagley, and I'm the State Conservation Engineer with NRCS New York. Presenting with me today is Jerry Lewis. He is an area engineer for the southeast area of New York. And today we are at the point in our discussions about construction inspection. Construction materials and methods are what we're going to talk about, and that quality assurance process that we are looking to ensure that and assure to our constituents, be that the landowner, NRCS, the taxpayers, and our certifying engineer, that the project was installed according to the plan, the contract documents, the design criteria, and the contract that the landowner may have. So first we're going to talk about what quality assurance is, and then we'll talk about what that basis is for what construction inspection is, what those inspection activities consist of, and different methods and materials used during construction, and examples of best management practices as completed. That's our objectives. We're going to kind of flow with this, but there's going to be things in the middle at times of opportunity where we'll talk about the inspection activity and methods and materials that you're seeing. So you'll notice that the presentation is quite long, lots of slides. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. There's probably plenty of questions on a lot of the photos that you see. I highly recommend, as a new employee, that you work with your area engineer or the individual that is overseeing your progression towards engineering job approval authority, and ask key questions of the information that you're seeing presented today. And if it's not presented today and you see it in your materials, please approach that person and ask for more detail, because there's never silly questions, and you really need to get to know your area engineer and that approving individual so that you can develop a comfort level and earn that job approval authority and experience. When they see that you're willing to ask those questions, that builds that comfort zone and that delegation and that trust. So what is quality assurance? To this point, we've been talking about conservation planning and identifying problems and proposing solutions that the owner may elect to pursue. The design process applies the science and technology and engineering theoretically to address those concerns. You know, we've done the plan, we've written up what people should be doing to do better, but then there's directing that work and giving the directions in project specifications, job sheets, implementation requirements. And designs are certified by individuals with the background, with the professional certification and giving that legal professional license to then say, we can tell the landowner what to do beyond this point. So construction implementation is step 8 of our conservation planning process that we'll be going into, where the conservation hits the ground. And that piece of paper and all the paper that you've collected from the beginning of the planning process till now actually becomes that item that's happening on the ground. So there's a whole, this presentation is super long, there's lots of slides, and it's only skimming the surface of quality assurance and construction inspection. I wanted to include a bunch of webinars and in-person classes that if you want to pursue this side of conservation implementation further, you're going to want to go visit our handbook for construction inspection that gives you detailed inspection items that you want to hit for certain practices and specifications, as well as more on quality control and assurance and your inspection duties as the conservation webinars. And there's a really great class for that NEDS puts out, and that's construction inspection for field office activities. So it's not your big dams, it's actually what the field office does on a regular basis. And it's in-person training, and they cover everything from how to use the laser level, how to take notes, and how to run calculations in the field for that construction activity. So now's the time to be looking at your individual development plan, and these are classes that you'll want to pursue. So we like talking with examples in mind. Pennsylvania put together these set of slides, and I think a lot of these sites might even have been boots on the ground type of sites that they had gone to and talked about in person, which I'm sure was a great experience for the new staff. The example that we're going to look at today is a 150 milking cow operation. Originally, these slides were given to us by Justin Gabriel and Jennifer Harold from Pennsylvania. So planning identifies the problems and offers solutions and alternatives that the owner elects to pursue. And as we discussed earlier today, we have to evaluate those alternatives to determine if it's something that the government, NRCS, USDA can actually help with. So today we're going to look at milk house waste runoff, the effects of an uncovered animal area, confined animal area, and a waste storage and transfer system that maybe has some losses in that system. So this is a covered or an uncovered waste or animal confinement area. You can see here that the waste is allowed to gravity run off the barnyard, and they happen to have the manure spreader parked there on the left adjacent to that push-off location. So as you can see from the material on the ground and the material on the spreader, it doesn't always make it there. The spreader's not always parked there. Downstream of the spreader is parked up there on the upper right of our site. You can see that there is a kill zone and some maybe not the greatest vegetation established. And here's more evidence of that looking closer at a different time of year. and then the milk house waste that goes directly to the ditch. These are the resource concerns identified and things that we know that we could do better to help our landowner. So what can we do? We can implement conservation practices that meet NRCS standards. So in this case, this is an agricultural waste management system, and the system is going to consist of animal waste collection, a storage to put that animal waste in so that you don't have those time periods where you're not getting full collection. A heavy use area protection with roofs and covers to exclude rainwater, and milk house waste transfer system that actually sends the milk house to the waste storage facility as opposed to overland flow. So here's some pictures of the end result of addressing those resource concerns. Here's your waste storage facility. We can see where the spreader used to be parked, and we're not seeing that kill zone any longer. Nice, healthy vegetation, roof over the barnyard area. Once again, we have curbs along the edge of the barnyard, no longer being discharged at will or during rainwater events. And we also have a roof. It looks like it's kind of in construction, but there's a roof they're looking to install adjacent to the barnyard. They installed a milk house waste collection system. This is a pump tank you're seeing here that gets pumped to the waste storage facility. And there's the waste storage facility. So how did we get there? You know, we've gotten from planning to here it is. Well, we have to go through construction and that implementation phase. And with that also comes that planning and design. And where that design comes to life is where the conservation hits the ground. So how did we get paper to become reality? Everything looks great on paper, but making sure it can be built and it's built according to that is key to getting good conservation on the ground. So construction inspection is the activity of ensuring that the design as a result of planning becomes that reality. Something that I wanted to say, I kind of said it earlier, but one more time, is that in step 7, the decisions are made where the design has to meet the criteria, and that criteria has been prepared through calculations and design documentations and assumptions made by the designer with the appropriate job approval authority. Contracts are written between the landowner and NRCS of what will be installed in order to receive financial assistance. And those are agreements to operate and maintain those structures. So what gets put into the design, the drawings, specifications, calculations, operation and maintenance documents, those need to be adhered to in order for that plan to move forward and be successful. So quality assurance, that construction inspection, is performed for the owner and the stakeholders of the project and ensures and observes that the construction methods and procedures are applied as prescribed. It reviews the quality control and testing activities done by the contractors and those individuals installing the practice. It measures for compliance with the contract provisions, that is the drawings and specifications, and documents the findings and observations for the owner's record. There's an as-built that is put in the file that indicates that the project was built according to approved drawings, specifications, and approved modifications. Quality control, that's the contractor's responsibility. As the inspector, you highlight to the contractor and the owner, this does or does not meet the plans and specifications as issued. So we're looking at in ensuring that that contractor and owner are doing what they are supposed to do to control the material purchase and selection for the job, and that they're applying the appropriate controls on the equipment and then labor installed to the appropriate techniques and methods. So back to what is construction inspection and quality assurance. Construction inspection is, again, the activity of ensuring that design becomes, that design and planning becomes a reality. NRCS may have a role in quality assurance. There's some times that we don't have a role, and the landowner has to prove to us that the contractor and their consultant, TSP perhaps, have to prove to us that quality assurance was applied, and they have to give us that documentation. And then you have the quality control where the contractor is responsible, and it might even be the landowner that's responsible to make sure that the materials as specified are installed according to the implementation requirements, be it seed or mulch and things like that. The landowner may install as opposed to a contractor. So the inspector confirms and assures that the project is installed according to the specified materials, and that a project is installed to the locations, dimensions, and grades using the construction materials specified in the plan. The inspector also verifies the work complies with the requirements and minimum construction standards. And it's required for a completion certificate. So somebody has to sign the as-built documentation, and that is the design approver has to sign the as-built documentation and assure to the taxpayer that the projects were installed according to the designs and specifications and standard criteria. So construction inspection, again, is the activity of ensuring the design becomes a reality. First and foremost, when you are preparing to do construction inspection, make sure you have the safety equipment and have been trained in the safety on construction sites. There's a lot to learn with that, and going out with a seasoned construction inspector to learn from them and to communicate with them what they've learned, and receiving that training is very important. You should have head and ear protection and wear boots and vests, no shorts on the construction site, please. And vest, the bright colored OSHA vest, so you can see and be seen. Your communication with the contractor when you're on site is very important, and making sure you're making eye contact when you're around moving vehicles with the operator is very important. Once again, safety is our priority for our employees on a construction site. There are tools that you should be familiar with and use during construction, and that would include a laser level, a surveying rod, a calculator, scale, stakes, markers, and definitely a camera to take pictures of those key construction activities. Plans and specifications, you should always have those on hand, and keeping notes on dates, times, and locations where things are installed. The inspection plan, your designer, the design approver, will highlight what inspection needs to be done, that they need to be on site for and see, and ensure documentation. So for each project, there should be a a construction inspection plan that's given to your inspector, and that starts that communication trail between the designer and the inspector. That designer and the inspector should be side by side as a team, facing this project together. Open lines of communication are very important. There will be a pre-construction meeting at the site prior to any digging or before the project actually starts to take formation. It's ideal that it happens before the contractor actually moves to the site with all its equipment and materials, so that everybody's on the same page of what inspections are necessary, who needs to be on site, and those points of contact. Documentation, conservation 6 notes and or a job diary should be kept throughout the construction phase. If you ever have a question on the job, there's never a stupid question. Please ask the designer if you're not comfortable talking to the contractor, but even like the methods that they're using and why, it's better to ask than to leave it unasked and say, well, I thought that looked strange, and then they have to redo it.
So, all right here, I'll probably jump in and take over, and I'll continue for a little bit. So like Paula emphasized earlier, we have like 130 slides, and we've just gotten to slide 22. And I think I see at least one question before I swapped over just now. And I think that question was, who was responsible for setting grade stakes at the construction site? So if I were to go back to slide 19, where Paula defined the responsibilities of quality assurance and quality control. So depending on where NRCS's involvement is or the district's involvement is, whoever is responsible for quality control is responsible for setting those grade stakes. It's the quality assurance responsibility to make sure that those grades were in fact actually met, if they actually met the design and specification requirements. Hopefully that answers that question. So picking up back here at slide 22, talking about construction inspection, ensuring paper becomes reality. There's so the design, the calculation, support, and documentation for the project, the drawings depict much about the project, location, elevations, and so forth. Specifications defines how construction sometimes and defines material quantities. But like Paula was just saying, and just want to emphasize, so the individual responsible for design approval must approve all modifications to the design drawings and specifications. These drawings and specifications are a legal document, and that person who is signing those, they must ensure that they have the appropriate job approval authority, engineering job approval authority, if it's all an engineering project. There's also something that we also need to understand about drawings versus specification, which takes precedence. At the end of the day, the specifications takes precedence, but your drawings must reflect consistently what's in the specification and vice versa. And as we move through the rest of these slides and presentations, if you have more questions, just go ahead and ask, and the moderator will let us know, and we'll try and jump in. So coming back to the pre-construction meeting, and we need to have some form of a checklist or guide to make sure that we are, in fact, following what's in the specifications and the construction inspection checklist. So we want to make sure that we have a pre-construction meeting. We want to make sure that all the stakeholders are at this meeting. You want the landowner or the contract holder to be on site. The contract holder and landowner might not always be the same person, but that's just how our programs work. You want the person who approved the design to be on site, unless that authority was delegated to a district staff or someone with appropriate construction inspection job approval authority to be on site. The person definitely who is going to actually make the recommendations for changes to the design approver needs to be there. You, the NRCS representative, who may or may not be approving payment, should be on site, planner, DC, so forth. You want all the contractors, or you want the general contractor who is going to be responsible for all the subcontractors to be on site. Now, if that general contractor will not be responsible for all the project activities, each individual responsible for a different level of the project, i.e. the grading, excavation guys, your rebar placement and tying guys, your concrete pour guy, whoever's going to do your fence, if you're doing a roof structure, who's erecting the pole barn, who's going to be responsible for the trusses and stuff, everyone who is responsible for different aspects of that construction activity has to be on site unless there's a general contractor who is going to be supervising and managing the entire project. So focusing on quality assurance, your responsibility, Paula emphasized the quality control aspect. Whoever is responsible for the different phases of that project, they're responsible for the different activities associated with that project. Our responsibility is to make sure that whatever they said that they did, before we move to the next phase, depending on the importance of the project or that level of activity, we have to go out and check it. And definitely if it's in the construction inspection plan, we have to verify. This is a picture of Paula here verifying, the excavator when they said that, hey, we have hit our grade or elevations and we're good. But we have to make sure that based on the construction inspection plan, that activity, before someone checks it off, that it's actually verified under quality assurance. You're going to check the installation procedures. Did they install the geotextile under the fill material like they said before they started, grading and erecting the structure? What equipment used for compaction? Was it adequate? Was the correct equipment used for compaction? Sheep's foot roller versus a smooth vibratory roller. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Are the posts installed at the proper depth relative to the floor? The post markings, the truss markings, all that stuff, we need to verify that. All the materials that's going to be in place and permanently set, we need to verify that what we call for in the specification is indeed on the ground. So we're going to check and identify constructability issues. So right now they're putting in the ramp, the floor is already poured. They're saying that, hey, we're ready to go with the walls and we're good, so we're good to, call the concrete truck in. But you know what? There was a ramp somewhere that wasn't placed. The contractor assured us, hey, we can get that in afterwards. Because of constructability issues and the experience of the inspector, and you want the inspector with appropriate level of not just JAA, but experience to be on site for these critical inspection points, you can make the determination that, you putting in a ramp after the fact here at this point is going to be problematic, and we've encountered issues in this situation before. You need to get the ramp in, or you need to get your roll curb in, or whatever. If they're going to promise you after the fact that, oh, we'll get the water stop in, after we, pour the concrete and stuff like that, that's a design change, because if the designer called for in the specifications PVC water stop to be tied to the L bars coming from the floor, and the contractor decided that, no, he's just going to use a bentonite strip, that is something that you need to have a conversation with the design approver about before you proceed. You're verifying rebar and all the stuff that's necessary at that point. So it's very important to make sure that your material that's specified in the specification is actually what's on site and what was placed, because it's either going to be you're going to find out now or you're going to find out later whether or not it's adequate. You really don't want to wait until the later. So how did we get here? So back to the project that we started talking about, how did paper become reality? So we had the pre-construction meeting. Everyone knew what their responsibilities were. Everyone knew.
Hey Jerry, before we move on, we had a couple questions in the chat that this might be a good spot to address.
Okay.
So Stefan asked about job approval authority. Job approval authority for district technicians or NRCS planners should be reviewed how often in general. So our policy as far as NRCS at the national level is that all job approval authority is to be reviewed, revisited, and documented that was revisited at least every 3 years. For new employees, the recommendation is the first year, but it should be recertified or revisited every 3 years. Stefan also asked, is there a construction site safety training program available online or by OSHA that you know of or recommend for new technicians or planners? I unfortunately don't have a recommendation for a class such as that. I know annually they have a Dig Safely program that we try to send technicians and staff to get a refresher on the dig safety rules when it applies to the pipelines and utilities. However, an OSHA class, we likely have one in the conservation webinars, but I'm not familiar with it. And you're very welcome, Stefan. Okay, Jerry, there you go.
Okay. So the pre-construction site meeting was conducted. Everyone, all the stakeholders, they were there. Everyone knew their responsibility, and, it's time to start construction. Moving forward, something that I didn't mention. So pre-construction site meeting, the earthwork and excavator guys, they were like, hey, we can come in here on Friday. We can start this thing. We'll have it ready, for rebar and all that stuff Tuesday morning. And the contractor, concrete construction contractor, and the rebar contractor are like, yeah, we can come in on Tuesday morning, we can get this done, we can have concrete poured by Thursday, and we should be good. Well, that's an indication right there that you're probably going to be in a world of hurt. Why? Because usually in a construction inspection sequence, there are benchmarks for where certain in site visits and inspection needs to take place. So no matter how motivated your contractors are, you want to make sure that everything that they're proposing, you can execute your responsibilities as the inspector, performing quality assurance on behalf of the landowner and the agency. So they say, hey, we're ready to start, putting out gravel and doing all that stuff. Well, the first thing you're going to come and check on site is your silt fence, making sure that we are protecting those resources, that we're actually doing these practices to protect and safeguard. And one of the key points in the construction activity is during the grading and stockpiling stuff, which should also be indicated on the drawing. Make sure the stakes are installed appropriately. You're, downstream of your silt fence. Make sure everything is stockpiled in the location that was planned. And if that location needs to be changed, talk to someone. If you're not the one that's approving or has the JAA to approve that change, that field change, make sure you get the appropriate approval for that. But the graders are going through, they're rocking and rolling. You came back a week later, silt fence is still up, everything is where it needs to be. Graders are performing their work, because they were set back because of storm events or something like that. As an inspector, what you're doing, make sure you have positive control or positive communication level in the construction site with heavy equipment operator. Make sure that they can see you, you can see them. Make sure what you want them to do, if you're instructing them, if that's a part of your responsibility during inspection, that they're actually performing tasks with you as the inspector in the job site, being visible and being safe. You're back to checking materials, making sure that your geotextile is what was called for in the specification, woven versus non-woven. Make sure you have your overlap. Make sure the material that they're bedding on that geotextile, make sure that it's appropriate. So there's an aspect of this that we're going to talk about, the soils and all that stuff. We're not really skipping over it, but we just want to talk about the materials, at this point. But I think that should be coming up right next. So make sure before they put those geotextile down that, hey, you have the elevations that you need and you have the consistency that you need before you start building up. The soil, make sure the soil is what it is when we were doing the planning. The soil scientists came out and said, yeah, we should be good. You have some nice clay stuff out here. But then next thing you know, you're hitting gravel. Well, gravel is fine if that's what you're looking for, but you have to know why certain things are specified. If you're doing a liquid waste storage or containment structure, and you call for clay in the specification, it has very poor strength, but it's excellent where compaction and impervious material is needed. If you're looking for to prevent transmissivity with water leaching out of that manure storage. If you're looking for gravel or sandy gravel or something like that, the reason for that is because gravel is excellent, where strength is concerned. It's good for bedding materials and so forth. Sand, good in strength, but cannot be compacted as easily, but mixed with gravel, silt, and clay, it becomes a really good compaction material. All of that stuff is important, and the reason or the necessity for specifying that is important for us to follow. You almost never want to do anything with organic soils unless you're doing a wetland, and that's even debatable, but that's something for a different class. Sands and gravels versus silts and clays. Sands and gravel good for foundation and drainage material, more erosion resistance, and silts and clays good materials for compaction, good liner materials. So coming back to, contractor notified you that, hey, we're ready to start laying rebar. Well, questions you need to ask or you need to have answered is, was the correct compaction equipment used? Was it adequate? Was it a sheep's foot roller versus a smooth vibratory roller? Things can happen on the job site, after you start excavating. You were expecting a tight, gravelly sand layer stuff, but then when you got down to your elevations, it's more, silty clay type of stuff. I mean, depending on how you work it, you could get it to where you need it. So, we specified a vibratory roller for a sandy gravel type material, but you ended up with a clay gravel or a clay sand type material. Well, you probably need to change the roller in order to get the compaction that you're looking for. Rebar's placed on top of your, filter fabric. In this particular example, they actually called for 2 layers of a geotextile material separated by a compacted layer gravel. You want to verify that what is called for in the design specifications and the drawings, that is actually being placed. So pay attention to that stuff. Take good documentation notes. Tape measure and a camera is going to be your best friend. Should be the minimum equipment that you take to the field when you're doing inspection. Verify that the rebar or your welded wire mesh, it's propped up by the appropriate material. No clay bricks. You want either concrete or you want metal chairs and stuff like that. You have the appropriate cover between the rebar and your form. You want to verify all of that stuff. Concrete's placed. Before that concrete is placed, you want to make sure that the water stop was installed where they said they were going to install it. The proper water stop is in place, and so you want to pay attention to the construction sequence and inspection sequence. If we are responsible as a part of our quality assurance objectives, if we're responsible for verifying, concrete in the field, make sure you have your appropriate equipment to do your slump test or whatever test that the designs called for. Make sure that you're getting the right slump from the concrete trucks. These are all things that you have to pay attention to. If it's called out in the specifications as being a part of the inspection plan, you performing quality assurance should at a minimum be able to verify what the contractor or the general manager for the site or the landowner is going to provide to you as saying that, hey, we met your standards and specifications and you need to pay us because, the project is complete. Before we get to that point, we should be able to verify some of this stuff. If the construction inspection plans also call for you to take concrete cylinders for tests, make sure that you, again, have the proper equipment. So at a minimum, most of the time, what's going to be required if you're doing cylinders is at least 3. Some people go to 4. That's 7-day, 14-day, and a 28-day strength. If something was to go wrong on site, you can have in your storage or wherever on site, at least 3 cylinders that you can say, hey, verify these breaks. Sometimes while they'll do a 4th, all 3 cylinders were, they were broken on schedule, 17, 14, and 28 day, but then 2 years later something happened. Well, that 4th cylinder can come back in handy if you needed to verify after the fact, was that indeed good concrete that was placed. Verifying rebar, your tape measure on site, in hand, with your camera, you can take pictures to verify, to document that, hey, the rebar was indeed placed. Depending on the structure, they were actually placed where they needed to be placed. If you're doing a liquid containment concrete structure, you're going to have a tighter space in rebar, the bottom third, and as you move up, it can, be, spaced differently. Well, just verify, document that, hey, this stuff was actually done. And if there was an issue, was it with the concrete, was it with the rebar, or was it with just poor workmanship after the fact? Make sure that if you have your pipes coming through walls, make sure that as documented in the design and in the specification, it's actually executed on site. Before they place forms and you can't see this stuff, you need to make sure that, you have some way of documenting or verifying that the rebar called out was actually placed and was placed in the correct location and the correct size. One of the things that you also need to verify, they're going to tell you that, hey, we're going to pour concrete tomorrow. You come on the job site and the forms are all placed. Well, how are you going to verify the rebar? Well, that's not even a bigger question. Forms are placed upright, but they're now just placing form oil or form grease. Well, that's a big no-no. So, Paula made the reference. It's like when you're baking, you put, grease on an oil pan. It's to make sure that stuff slips off when you're done baking. Well, if you get form grease or oil on your rebar, chances are that rebar is not going to bond to your concrete like you intend to. So form grease, form oil, that all needs to be done before the forms are erected. So as a site, inspector, this might be a part, the responsibility of quality control, but if you observe this activity while you're on site for quality assurance purposes, you can say to the landowner, I don't think you're ready for concrete yet because those rebars, now you have to remove the forms and you have to actually power wash those rebars to get the oils off of it and then try again in another week or so. Or you talk to the designer of record just to make sure that they know what's going on.
Hi, Jerry.
Go ahead.
This is about where our break is, our bio break. Do we want to
I'm good for it.
Give everybody that opportunity at the moment?
Sure.
Okay. Given that this is where we're going to break, I would like to see everybody back here.
Yes, I am.
All righty. Continue on, please.
Okay, thank you. All right, welcome back, everyone, and hopefully you had a really good, refreshing break. So in about a few slides, we will probably encourage you to start asking questions, but I'm just going to go through the rest of these slides for a little bit and just pointing out some things during the construction activity. So the concrete pump trucks are on site. They're placed in concrete. Everyone is more busier than usual. The appropriate concrete placement equipments are there. There's a pump truck in the background. You have 2 trucks at the same time dumping into the pump truck's hopper, getting that material to where it needs to be placed. Someone's on the elephant trunk, making sure that folks are there doing what they're supposed to do. It's at this point that something very important that, if you're doing quality assurance, that you might want to take note of. If you're doing quality control, you definitely need to be involved in. If you're doing quality control, these guys need to make sure that they're not letting that concrete fall more than 5 feet by ACI standards, nor are they moving too far along before they start vibrating it. And then also that making sure that they're not, placing the concrete in over a 4-foot or 5-foot lift, and that will be important when we get to the next slide. If they're doing that, if you have a 14-foot wall and they're placing concrete in 8-foot lifts, you're going to start seeing as they progress through, or when they remove the forms, you're kind of going to start seeing where the concrete started to set, and you're going to start having cold joints or develop in that placement. So follow the specifications if you're doing quality control on site. Quality assurance, your main objective is to make sure that those form ties, after they are removed, that the contractor, they're coming back over and they're filling those with epoxy or whatever is specified in the construction specification, because those can rot through between the waste storage and the earthwork buildup behind it. We've had situations where, you have peepholes developing in that concrete wall, and landowner is wondering why, he's having way more storage capacity develop, beyond what was designed. Pipe bedding and placement, make sure that is taking place, and if this is part of your construction inspection responsibilities, make sure that that's done appropriately. It becomes very important. Make sure that, excavators are being safe. We're trying to get a transfer line in, between the waste point generation and the waste storage. We just want to be careful, make sure that stuff is being done the way it's supposed to be done, make sure that the right materials are on site. If you're precasting a hopper or whatever transfer manhole section somewhere along that line, if it's being done on site, make sure that the right elevations and grades are have been met before they start placing concrete for that. Make sure that the proper sections are where it's called out to be. If there are field changes during construction, if you're responsible for quality control, the landowner changes his mind. I don't want to put the hopper or the manhole here anymore. I want to put it over here. Double check with your design approver for all field change requests. They're going to ask you on site if we can do this. That's a design change. You need to get proper approval, because the person with the appropriate design approval authority has to make that change. Again, make sure that they're using the appropriate equipment to do compaction around that pipe. The appropriate material is being compacted, as opposed to something stilty when, the contract or the specification calls for a drain fill. Make sure that they're using the right equipment to place the sections along that transfer line section. And make sure that they're using, again, the appropriate compaction equipment. In most cases, you're not allowed to use anything beyond a hand tamp or vibratory tamper around a pipe if you're going to do that, mechanically compact it. And you can't do anything above a hand-driven tamp before you get to certain elevations. Typically, based on the design specification, the designer might say, hey, not before 5 feet of buried depth above the pipe before you can use driven compaction equipment. The compaction strength, the pipe strength, rupture strength, and all that stuff is figured into the design before it's actually selected. So there's a big reason for that. And there they're using the hand tamper again, up in the top section for that hopper. So we've done what we needed to do to address the resource concern. We're pretty much, standing back, 2 weeks after someone is coming out to certify to say, hey, the structure was placed based on the construction inspection photos and all the documentation. I think it was installed appropriately. Let's go spot check it and see what's there, if it's really what we wanted, and if we're indeed ready to make payment. So how did we finish?
So, I'm sorry. I'm off mute, I hope. This is Paula. So the design approver will come back to the site, walk the site over with the inspector, contractor, landowner, and that would be a project final inspection. A punch list will be created ideally, and to be most cost efficient, especially for the landowner's cost and the contractor's cost, is to ensure that the vehicles haven't been taken off to do that final work, and that that any touch-up work that needs to be done, or you get there to do this final inspection pre the point that everybody wants to move off-site. You can do semi-final inspections when backfill happens or just before concrete's poured. You get those in-person inspections, but that final punch list should be before everybody is ready to move. And that's the inspector's. That's one of the inspector's roles, is to coordinate all those individuals to be on site at the right time to ensure efficiency. So you'll create a list of what needs to be finished prior to the design approver giving that final approval for the project. And that final approval for the, next slide. That final approval for the project is going to be the documentation that the NRCS contract representative is going to use to process that payment. One of the things that we do as NRCS is we work as a team, multidisciplinary, and everybody has the things they're good at, maybe not so good at. And one of those things is not everybody is an engineer. Not everybody has design approval authorities for those level 5 practices, or even all the practices. But we work together as a team and advise one another when a project is finished. But you have to have that documentation in hand before you issue that payment. Otherwise, you're obligating the government for something that wasn't completed, which in contracting terms is improper payment. We don't want to go down that road. What a design approver that is going to give you certification on a final project is looking for is the as-built documentation, that everything was installed according to the plans and specifications. All modifications done had pre-approval. And we in New York have a list that helps, and they basically a list or something that we go through with the inspector and the construction or the contract representative that says, hey, this is what was designed, this is what was constructed, this is why there were changes during construction, and it all meets the standards and specifications according to NRCS policies and procedures. So you have that sort of go-to document at your final payment scenario. With an as-built comes red line drawings. The only time you should see red on a drawing is if it indicates the as-built condition. And that would be when the individual would take, you can take a pen, a pencil, or something and mark those drawings with that as-built condition. It does not have to be done in CAD or on a computer, and you can make your as-built as you go as the inspector. You will also provide photos of pre, post, and during construction with those key inspection points labeled, and that's something that your design certifier will be looking for to process that final certification. And now we have examples of before and after construction. But right now we have a question from Dan Polite. And hopefully I said your name right. How do you handle when you are at a construction site and the contractors are not wearing proper safety equipment, hard hat? Who's responsible to tell them what they need to be wearing? So it depends on your roles and responsibilities as outlined in the construction documents and who your contract is with. So a lot of times, and many times, our contract is with the landowner. So if we see an unsafe condition, we are ensuring, we are doing quality assurance. We need to let the contractor know we see an unsafe condition and let the landowner know if we see an unsafe condition, and this is not following our plans and specifications. NRCS plans and specifications require that certain OSHA standards as identified by NRCS are being followed, and that's in those construction drawing documents. So there's a lot of policy involved with that, but our role is to identify when their safety is being compromised and let everybody know. And then, who's responsible to tell them what to do? It's the contractor's responsibility to get his employees in line, and it's the landowner's responsibility to ensure that the contractor is following the contract he's obligated to. So hopefully that is that covers it enough. So before and after construction. Next slide. So in this situation, we have a barnyard with a barn cleaner, maybe some foot traffic, maybe not some foot traffic. It looks like there might be times that the spreader has been there. And I say foot traffic, I mean animal traffic, sorry. And there may be times that the manure is not being spread daily and they're just cleaning it out and piling up the side. We can see some obvious loss in nutrients and some water quality issues here. So let's go see what we did. In this case, we do have animal traffic here, and it looks like we created a spot for a manure spreader to be pushed into, as well as some area for the manure to be piled on temporarily, and a heavy use area for the cows. Nice and clean. Next slide. In here we see it looks like we can't quite tell what's maybe an abuse area or a heavy use area, and where that line is to the pasture or to a water quality concern. So, and does the herd need all of this area to frolic in and create compaction? Next slide. So in this case, we built a barnyard adjacent to the structure. We got a nice, the heavy use area is now confined to a smaller area, maybe to what the animals need, a little bit healthier on the hooves because they're not walking around in mud and rocks. And we have a nice separation between the pasture area or the former pasture area that might be ready to go into cover crop, and perhaps we can get some soil health going on there. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's go back one slide. And this is where we talk about one of the things that we consider in design of a barnyard, and that is cows are expensive and concrete is slippery when wet and icy. You know, a 1,500 pound cow could slip and break a hip and cause some vet bills and issues. One of the things that we work into all heavy use area designs that have cattle on them is grooving. So this next slide shows a grooving that was specified for this project. Notice that they do the grooving just after, the grooving has special timing as far as construction and inspection goes after it's been bull floated, but before this sealing treatment. And that is a art and skill that the contractors will need to identify when that treatment can happen. But there's also a tool that they use for this specific site, next slide, which is a grooved float. I've seen a couple different versions of this tool, but those grooves have certain dimensions that are specified in our specifications so that the hoof, the edge of hoof has good contact to prevent that slippage. Sometimes contractors will try to push you to, as an inspector, to accept a brush finish or just a flat finish, and we can't accept that on this. And as as an inspector, you need to be firm and tell them, you know, what you did on another project is not the same as this project. We have specifications and we have them for a reason, and this needs to be installed according to the specifications. Next slide.
So it's a similar situation here. So the animals, you know, they're out, they're allowed to be out, you know, in this particular area close to the barn. But then the landowner's having some issues with that. One, they're creating a resource concern or affecting one of our natural resources, which we generally try to protect. You know, rainwater, gutter water, and all that stuff, it comes down to this open area, abused area, and eventually drains at the edge of the section, and it goes out, you know, to a water course. Well, in the planning phase of things, you know, the landowner made some things known that, you know, all his cows come over here because this is the only place that he can actually let them out. Everywhere else, it's either, you know, pasture, hay, or something like that. But he's like, his dry cows come out, you know, his milking cows come out, and his bulls sometimes come out there, and he's like, he wants help. Well, we came in there and we provided some help, some alternative to what he's been doing, you know, a barnyard area, you know, heavy use area to restrict some of that abuse that's happening on the soils. We also give him some fence so he can actually section off his animals, you know, keep his dry cows separate, you know, lactating cows and all that stuff, you know, potentially even separate his bull. But all of that, you know, it helps to address the resource concern with that water runoff from that abused area actually getting into a water course. This was quite interesting. Do you want to talk about this one, Paula?
Oh, sure. You can hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay. So in this case, this looks like an EWP project, which is the Emergency Watershed Protection Project. And this site looks like, the next picture shows it better, but there's a infrastructure concern here, as well as looks like a loss of maybe the foundation to a house is imminent if this doesn't get taken care of. Next slide. In this case, we see that there was actually, it looks like a gas line or perhaps a sewer line. I'm hoping that's not sewer because it's above ground and probably in Pennsylvania, so we don't want it to freeze. But we see that there is a utility that crosses the embankment there. This is kind of a fancy EWP site. They likely had additional funds applied from the sponsor to go above and beyond NRCS standard because it's in a more urban scenario. Next slide. And this is more traditional dump rock, slope rock scenario for keeping the stream banks where they are and reducing erosion after a storm event.
So before scenario, I mean, just looking at this, you can't really tell what it is or what's going on here. But in the after picture, you will get a better sense. So there was probably some storm event that came, washed out a dike or something. They had to put it back, or converting, you know, or returning pasture land that was prior converted back to a wetland. But in any case, you know, some of our practices afford for that, you know, put in a dike, structure for water control, an outlet, emergency spillway, and stuff like that. So we'll talk some more about some best management practices for the different resource concerns that you may or may not encounter as a planner. I think I saw a question earlier asking about concrete. I don't know.
Yeah, there was a question about one of the slides showed, I think it was that barnyard with the water running through it. There you go. Do you have the after slide for that?
Yep.
there it is. That's the after. That's not actually earth. That is the concrete after it's been operated over a extended period of time. You see that there is a buildup of manure and looks like bedding that's been tracked in and out of the bedded pack area.
So BMPs and materials. You want to start?
So this is, yeah, sure. So this is contour stripping. I think it was talked about earlier in the presentations that this is one of the most beneficial practices we do. And it's one of my favorite to look out over the country when you're flying from one place to another and seeing our impact on the ground. It's kind of awesome anyway. You get to talk to people and say, you know what, because they're like, what does an engineer do for USDA? You know, you inspect meat, and I'm like, no, we do that stuff. Next slide, please. Here's a cropland terrace. So a cropland terrace actually stores sediment and water coming off of the cropland so that it doesn't get transferred to another part of the farm, as well as you're not losing that water super fast and might be able to get into that soil profile. Next slide. Here's a diversion. Once again, you're not losing the water super fast with a diversion. That it potentially could have been going, the water could have been coming off that hill and going through that new barnyard if you didn't have this diversion there. You're increasing the time of concentration of the water coming off of the farmland so that you're getting more infiltration and lower peak discharge from the farm. And also, this diversion is protecting that engineering structure of the barnyard from inundation. Next slide. Here's a grass waterway. This was probably a gully at one time where the water was more concentrated into the center of this area. And to be able to broaden and extend the wetted perimeter of the channel itself lowers the velocities and increases the capacity of what this channel can take so that it is safely transferred from one end of the farm to another.
Surface inlet. So most of the time, when you have like maybe a terrace, a diversion, or a waterway going across, croplands and stuff, sometimes you hit obstacles to where you can't adequately divert that water to where you actually want to do an outlet. So sometimes what you end up doing is actually do a surface inlet to take that water from, from the point that you're delivering it to actually the point that it actually needs to be discharged. There are different types of surface inlets. This is one of them. There's other surface drainage, and this is an actual rock outlet for in a situation like you'd use for an outlet on a diversion, a waterway, and or even at the edge of field for one of those dike structures. And sometimes, like Paula was talking about, sometimes we can't take all that water across the surface in a diversion, but we can actually do what is called centerline drain ditches, or using drop structures, we can actually divert some flows from that surface below ground to your outlet while the actual surface takes smaller flows. Water level control box and blind inlet. Again, it's just another structure that we can use to help us in a scenario to where initially we talked about a wetland or a dam or something like that. So this up here in the corner, it's a flashboard riser, and at some point here, there is actually an inlet to that structure. this is typical of what you would see when you're doing a spring development, when you're tapping into an existing pond. You need to get some water from that pond, to your animals out in the field, in a water facility type of scenario. This is kind of the structures that you'll see. So right now we're talking about the BMPs, mostly, after they're completed. But as part of your construction inspection responsibilities, you're going to come in here and, just as well with the earthwork we talked about under that tank, you're going to verify the elevations and the grades, the cutback slopes. If you're tapping into an existing structure, you're going to verify the materials that they're bringing in before they start to backfill. You're going to verify that the right outlet or inlet is selected for the structure that's going in the ground. Paula?
So this is the, I think this is sort of the after picture of the wetlands restoration that we saw. And something that Kim talked about yesterday is those rough edges for habitat. This is kind of a great example of seeing where the high water mark might actually be during the wet season, where that tree tipped over right there. But you have these small areas that might have maybe a seed bed that would establish and attract some of your wildlife in the growing season. And this is a barnyard with a roofed manure stack area. The next few slides go together, and that is that this is where there's a manure stacking area, and in the operation and maintenance, it's likely that the landowner pushes any manure that would accumulate on the pad back into this stacking area for spreading at the right time, right location, at the right rate. Additionally, from here you see that there is a lot of surface area exposed to rain on this barnyard. So next slide shows you the collection point of that runoff, where it all kind of goes to from the pad. And in this is a screen box. I've not seen a screen box like this, but I really like the aspect of that these screens are something that can be pulled out by hand and repaired without too much cost to your landowner. What you're seeing is the screens get finer from the front to the back, so that there's a riser in the back that takes the clean water out to a vegetative treatment area level spreader. In this case, you'll see that the solids stay on the barnyard, and you want the actual water to make it to the VTA. If you're not getting enough water to the VTA and you're getting more solids, you might have to switch up your screen box, clean it more often, and that's operation and maintenance that the landowner has agreed to back at the design phase. Next slide. This is an example of a level spreader, and this is an above ground level spreader. Those holes are at a certain diameter and distance on that pipe, that then and the pipe is at a certain slope, and that's all figured out in the design documents to ensure that you're getting the appropriate level of ponding on the pad to minimize the discharge, the design discharge rate to this facility, as well as getting a nice uniform spread across that gravel level spreader up on the top. Here is the VTA. You'll see that pipe, you see that white line up there is that same spreader pipe. Probably not the same from the previous picture because that one looks shorter, but this is this matches the initial project we were looking at. And
yeah.
So it goes from there to there. And this you see is about the point that the VTA area has been seeded down. You probably want to get it more established than this prior to discharging to your VTA. Just give it a little bit more time. You can see it's somewhat rutted, and the grass is still young, not a full stand yet. Just give it a little more time if you can do it. But this whole area that you see, kind of like where this gentleman's feet are into the page where we are, as well as over on that far left, is the area that's considered the treatment area for that VTA, vegetative treatment area, which is different than buffer strip or filter strip. They're different practices entirely.
So this is a small carcass composting shed. So again, these are things that, that we can use, BMPs, that we can use in the field to help landowners, address a resource concern. Maybe he was just composting, small carcasses, out in the open, and everything was just running. You can see it's up on the top of a hill. It's just running down to the stream, the creek, and eventually getting into, a water course that we're trying to protect. So implementing a BMP here provides a lot of utility and helps us address a resource concern. There's a biological component to this composting that, some of you may or may not be familiar with. There's in your O&M, you're going to have something that tells you the temperatures that you need to, manage this composter at, in that, you can't let it exceed a certain temperature. You could create a fire. You could, destroy your structure and stuff like that. But all of this stuff is, you'll get more experience with out in the field. And I think there's a question out there.
Actually, what we need to know is, let's see, we need to talk about, is it time for questions? We're close. We got 4 minutes left for our presentation, and it looks like lots of slides. So before we get to your questions, what I want to say is that we did include a lot of photos and a lot of food for thought for you to work with your designer and engineer and understand when you're planning these practices kind of what they look like when they're done, because that it's important to understand that and be able to explain that with a landowner when you're planning as well.
Should I go on, or any questions? Right. So this is just
I don't see any questions.
Okay. So this is just a bigger version of the small animal composting, carcass composting. This is a roof stacking area. Landowner can, do some composting of bigger animals in this shed. It's a covered section, earthen floor, but nonetheless, the BMP that is selected by the planner, and sometimes, if they bring the engineer on, early enough in the process, can help to provide a better solution to the landowner if we get involved earlier. Some of the things that we do are roof gutters as well, well drilling. There's a few more slides that talk about, wells and stuff like that, and it's going to transition into a watering facility. So, in New York, we have a standard nationally for wells and stuff like that. We encourage wells, in the case of like a grazing operation, most of the time. If your responsibility for inspecting the construction sequence for a well, you want to follow those inspection documents carefully. You want to encourage safety and stuff like that. So you want to know the type of equipment that is going to be used and how it's going to be used appropriately. For the most part, the biggest thing from this process that we want to document is a copy of that well driller's log. You want to have a copy of that when they're done. It's going to verify the depth that we're paying for. If we're paying for it, it's going to verify the well production levels, and it's going to, verify that, the casings was installed appropriately. the well cap and stuff like that. You know, one of the biggest questions is who determines the site, you know, for a well, you know. NRCS, we have our, you know, water witchers out there, or, you know, AKA geologists, and they can provide us a lot of help and guidance in how to site a well appropriately. I think we just had one hired for this region, Matt Sandifor. So I think he's on as well. But nonetheless, you know, talk to your designer, talk to your planner, you know, make sure you have a good understanding of what you're doing and what the landowner is asking for when it comes to planning and executing these practices, these BMPs. In addition to your well cap, you know, your well casing cover, I mean, the well cap is very important. One of the big things is, depending on where you're siting your well, you want to protect that well head. We've just put a big old hole, deep hole in the earth. Now you have a direct point where water can potentially get down to that aquifer that you're pulling from. You want to make sure that your well cap is in place and mounted appropriately to protect that water source. Pressure tanks and stuff, make sure everything is appropriately sized, make sure that the size specified is actually the size installed, make sure that the fittings are installed, whether they're lead-free brass for fittings or just brass fittings or whatever combination of specifications that might be called out. Just make sure that the appropriate material is delivered to the site and is actually in place. For the electrical component, make sure that you have, you know, someone with the appropriate certification to certify that you know, the electrical system for that entire, you know, pump appurtenance and all that stuff is actually installed appropriately. Paula?
Yes, there was a question, or maybe a statement, that the conservation practice code for water well is 642. And one thing I wanted to talk about was there is a difference between construction specifications and standards, and that needs to be well understood. There's a conservation practice code in practice that you need to follow the state rules and regulations for implementation as well. So a lot of times states will have a different construction specification for a water well that will cover the requirements of the state during those installations. And that goes along with a lot of different practices. So there's always been debate of specifications, implementation requirements, and standards. Your standards and statements of work are going to be the two governing documents on how standards are applied. Your site-specific specifications and site-specific items of work or implementation requirements are what are going to be those certified documents that tell you and the landowner what is required to implement in order to meet that conservation practice standard. So with spring development, the landowner may have a natural spring on the farm that they have record of, that maybe record or they've been on the farm for their generations, and they know that this is a reliable source of water that they want to tap into as far as a source. And there's different mechanisms that we use to develop springs. Next slide.
How much more time do we have on the presentation?
Nancy, I don't want to overstep anybody. You might want to tell us when to stop.
All right. You officially stopped 4 minutes ago.
Okay.
Okay.
So like we said, there's a lot of slides here, and we just wanted to, develop some of the pictures and talk about it a little bit, to give the students some perspective when they go through the handouts and stuff like that. But, I mean, we can stop here, and we will be good.
All right. Thank you so very much.
No problem. And we'll be here at the end if there's any questions at the end that, as long as we're not, taking up other people's time, we'll be here.
Okay, so Darren, you want to bring your slides up?
I sure do, yes. Okay, we ready to go? Great. So I'll take silence as a yes. So hi, folks. My name's Darren Davis. I'm the State Conservation Engineer in Massachusetts. I've been here about 6 years. Prior to that, I worked in New York for about 16 years as a field engineer, working with Paula Bagley and Jerry Lewis on many occasions. Nice to hear you guys. I thought you did a great job. One thing I'll say just briefly on that presentation, and folks, we're throwing a ton of stuff at you fast. I'm sure that, that's the way it goes with these presentations. And one thing about engineering practices is sometimes they can be a bit intimidating, when you're not familiar with them, and folks may not, be a little uncomfortable planning them and things like that. Well, I just encourage you to get by that quickly. Work with your engineers, work with your technicians, your experienced planners. They're really a valuable tool, and you see a lot of dramatic improvements when you get a lot of these practices. Although they are complex, they're certainly worthwhile. So, changing gears just a bit, we're going to talk about working with landowners and farmers. So this is really the communication portion of it we're going to talk about. And before I'll finish my introduction. So again, I worked in New York for many years. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, the Bloomsburg area. I grew up on a small farm outside of Bloomsburg. Went to Penn State University. So I've been in the agency about 22 years now. Joining me today is Manuel Diaz-Gonzalez here in Massachusetts. Manuel, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, sir. I am Manuel Diaz, and I love my job. I'm a field engineer here in the state office in Massachusetts. I've worked directly for Darren. I am from Puerto Rico. I've been with the agency for 11 years. I've been an engineer in Washington, Utah, Idaho, New Hampshire, and now here in Massachusetts, where I hope to stay. And I'm going to tag along with Darren on this presentation.
Great. So we'll get started. Our presentation is about a half an hour long. Again, lots of slides in here. We may or may not get through everything, but we'll just jump in and get started. So, again, what we're talking about here is working with landowners and farmers. And that's something that may be comfortable for many of you and may be a little bit uncomfortable for some others. So it's certainly an important aspect of the job. And, the first slide here we're talking about making a good impression. And that's important. Get off on the first step, make the first step, get off on the right step. That's what I want to say. So, going through some of these bullets here, make an appointment to work around their schedule. Farmers are working at their home where they live. They're very busy. They have a lot of different things going on. And, they're going to be, what their day is lined up to be may not turn out to be like that, which happens in many professions, right? But especially in the farming community. So make an appointment. Just don't drive up and think you're going to have time to be made, they're going to give you time to talk. So think about that. Be on time, though, because in the rare chance they're trying to coordinate and schedule around you, if you're not there on time, that can be irritating, right? I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but government employees are not always looked upon as being favorable occupations. If you look through different perspectives, some folks say government employees are a little bit lazy, a little bit relaxed, don't get a lot done, things like that. So we need to take care of that right away and making a good impression so that we don't have to deal with that down the road. We want to make them understand that NRCS folks are here to help. We are technical experts, and we're really, passionate about what we do and can really help them and help the resource issues. Other things here, if you're running late, give them a call. Obviously, that's sort of self-explanatory. Next one, try to limit the number of people on the visit, especially early on. Again, it's that perspective. If 4 government vehicles drive up and 5 people jump out, to talk to the landowner. One, that can be a bit intimidating, right? You don't know everybody. You have a lot of folks here. The government can get to know you. They might not know if we're regulatory or not. They may think all government people have some level of regulation to them and they're going to get them in trouble. And we need to get rid of that idea right away and say, hey, we're here to help you. We're not looking to see everything that's wrong with your farm, and we're not trying to intimidate you by a bunch of folks showing up at once. And also it leads to being accountable and efficient with our resources. To have that many people out can be looked upon unfavorably. That being said, where you all are in your career, you may be asked to go along now, because when you built a relationship with a landowner, you have that understanding. We often do take, some of the more recent hires. We have our volunteers, or we have our student trainees and things like that, and that is certainly a good thing to do. You just have to do it in the right time frame. Again, travel together, limit cars. It looks a little better. Obviously, in the time of COVID-19, we're not doing that, and that's certainly understand at this time. Hopefully, in the future, we'll be back to somewhat of a normal situation where we're able to then carpool a little bit easier. And actually, obviously, talk to your state. Will each have their own requirements on how many people can be in a car at this point, I'm sure. Don't talk against other farmers. This is an important one. Even if the farmer you're talking to is giving some grief about other farmers, don't join in on that, right? We apply our practices and we apply our service to everyone equitably, right? So, if someone's bantering a little bit and talking about someone else doing something wrong, don't join in. That's something to think about. And it's easy to do, right? That's human nature in some regards. So keep that in mind. Another very important one is if you don't know the answer to a question, tell them. Don't try and act like you know it all. They'll see right through that. It often leads to many problems down the road. And that's one thing that's served me well in my career, and I've never really had much of an issue with it. If I look at someone and say, listen, I don't know the answer, but I'll find out for you and I'll get back to you. They may give you, I've really not had much feedback or grief from that at all. That's a valid answer and usually respected. Obviously, don't goof off. Don't act like you've never been on a farm before, never seen a cow, never seen a tractor, even if you haven't. It's all right to take an interest in what's going on and ask questions, but certainly there's a level of professionalism we want to keep. Park out of the way. Some of you all may not be familiar that there's a lot going on in a farm in a day, especially maybe a dairy farm where you have a milk truck pulling up to pump the milk out, feed being delivered. That could be an 18-wheeler that's coming in. And if you park right in the middle of an area that's heavily trafficked, you're going to be in the way. So try and think about that when you're approaching. And then also you can always ask the landowner, hey, I just parked over there. Is that going to be okay? Are we out of the way for everybody? So something to think about there. And the last one is interesting. Be selective where you stop for lunch. You may not think of that, but often we're traveling in rural areas. We have several appointments throughout the day. We're going to stop somewhere and eat. We're right in the middle of the rural area where there may be farmers coming in, relatives coming into the farm of the farmers. They'll see you there. They'll see your vehicle there. You don't want to be there for an hour and a half. You don't want to, even if you are taking leave, it doesn't look good. Be selective where you go. Understand that you're representing NRCS, you're representing the government, and you want to make sure you're showing some professionalism and that, hey, yeah, we're not the stereotype. We work hard. We're out here and efficient with our time and our resources. So, next slide. So again, working towards building that good relationship. The first one is a great requirement. You got to listen and be an active listener. Really listen to what the farmer is talking about, their concerns, their answers. Take good notes, which is on this list. Write things down that they've said. Again, the resource issues that we're dealing with, we're going to address them and we're leaving. The farmer's going to be there to take care of what we put in. They're going to operate and maintain it. We have to get their buy-in. We have to make sure they're fully engaged in the whole process. So listen to them, what they're saying. Don't rush to a visit. You may have 5 farms you're trying to get to in a day. If there's a farmer that's there giving you their time, willing to go get through a lot of work and discussions, take the time and do it. Obviously, call ahead to the next farms, let them know you may be late, reschedule as you need. and try and schedule yourself so that you give farmers time. Try not, there's that boundary of being efficient and also being respectful of the time of others. So be prepared, do your homework. I like to see people have an awareness of the soils when they get onto a farm, because so much of what we do is either in it, on it, or dealing with it. So, kind of have that homework done. Look at some of the maps, know where you're going to be. The last one, compliment them. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but, farmers are doing a lot of work. They do a lot of hard work, and they deal with a lot of different things, and a lot of times they're addressing some of the resources they're trying to as best they can, and don't be afraid to compliment them on that. That, again, builds trust and a good relationship. So now, remember, individual landowners control private land. And looking at some of these pictures, those attitudes, you're going on to their business, and you're also going to where they live, most likely, their home, right? So, and you may see signs like this. The government, they're not portrayed well in that first sign. Looking at, watch for Kate. I don't know who Kate is, but that's a warning sign. So we're going to where they are, and we have to understand that. And, something to consider here is the level of political correctness or lack thereof that you may encounter on a farm when it may not be what you're accustomed to. And comments that you may believe are derogatory or inappropriate may not be intended that way. If you've not grown up in a rural area or been around farmers, it may be quite foreign to you. And, really, you're going to have to make a judgment call here a little bit. Take that in, and, what's being said may just be part of the culture that you're in at that time. That being said, you should never be in a position or stay in a position where you're being verbally abused or degraded, right? So they may make some comments, and it takes you off guard a little bit. You're going to have to, analyze, interpret that, and say, okay, is this just the way they interact, and maybe that's not what I'm used to, or is it something a little more serious? You never should feel threatened. Obviously, then you can get yourself out of that situation. And certainly, I'd expect, I'd like you to, talk with your supervisors about this, talk with experienced coworkers about this. But that is something to consider. There's different generational things going on, and it's something that's certainly forefront in the society today, and it's something to think about. And I encourage you to all kind of have those conversations in the office. And I'll turn it over at this point to Manuel.
We see diversity everywhere, and landowner diversity is not the exception. We are used from the media and classes, we're used to hear about race, nationality, religion, age, sexual orientation, and so on. But and that certainly applies to landowners and customers too. But we are also talking about diversity beyond that. For instance, production, landscape, location, whether the customer is a landowner or he's a tenant or she or they, the pronoun that they prefer to be used, to be called for or refer as. Another thing that could be considered diversity in our job could be new to farming or a generational farmer. That being said, just make judgment calls as you move into the planning process, whether you're an engineer or a planner, addressing the needs for the customer based on how diverse they are and what that diversity implies to their operation. Next slide. Darren. On at least how I see it, customers also are diverse on their preferences. For instance, some customers may be open to certain practices and not to others. Management-intensive grazing is something that many farmers, many ranchers would prefer, while others may be more inclined to stay with traditional rotational grazing, just to make one example. Next slide. A somewhat dramatic example that we have in our area in terms of diversity is working with the Amish. The Amish are a group that live in our area, and they also want environmental improvement. It is important to communicate with them in a way that they're comfortable with, whether that is personal communication or letters or whatever they're comfortable with. We need to be aware of their level of education, the roles in the family between men, women, and parents, children, grandparents, and whatnot, how cost share is share with them, and how money is transferred with young people within the Amish community. Just be aware of who actually makes the decisions and whatnot. And even when this is an example of for the Amish community, we may be working with other communities that we need to be aware of their environment and be respectful of it to the full extent. Darren?
Yes. All right. Back to me now. So we're going to talk a little bit more about making the farm visits and how we might do that. So here, let them finish working. Ask to take a look around until they're ready for the visit. So this example shows farmers milking cows, right? And this is something that can't be rescheduled or delayed. Cows have to be milked. This is how they make their money, and we need to be sensitive to that. So when we show up, if the milking's being done and they're not quite ready for us, understand that and adjust. So again, we're going into their place of business. Other farms may have other things going on that need to be done at that time as well. So, we just have to adjust to that. Also, look to compliment when you can. For instance, I like this picture. It's a good example, right? So maybe off to the left of this picture, we might have a stream or a well or something that's a potential resource issue. And we see manure running off this concrete and over to that area, and maybe we would be concerned by it. And certainly that's valid. But if you look here, it's concreted, and there's some blocks that have been put here. That's an effort to go ahead and clean this area up. So they've taken that initiative potentially to do some things to say, okay, I'm going to contain this manure area because I know it's a problem, and it could potentially hinder and make issues for other areas. The fence is up. This area is fenced out. Granted, there's no curb, but don't be afraid to compliment that they are looking by far and wide that farmers I've encountered want to do the right thing with the resource issues. They really do. This is nothing new. You're not trying to have them convince them that it's the right thing to do. It's just assisting them in getting it done. So look to do that. Okay, family pet. 2 points here. One, do not try and do this when you visit the farm. These are not your pets. Okay? Secondly, cows are much more than milk producers to many farmers, and understand that. They are like members of the family, like the family pet. So be respectful around them, things like that. And that I think that is enough said on that. Farm office. For those of you not familiar with this piece of equipment, it's the bulk tank in a dairy farm. So this is where the milk goes after it leaves the cow. So the cows get milked, milk ends up here. The example of this is, this is the covered area that's clean and dry, and often a good spot to sit and talk about what you want to talk about with the farmer. So, and it's a flat surface. So here we have an opportunity to spread some things out and talk to the farmer. Understand you're not always going to walk into an office and be able to spread out, or the kitchen table. You're going to have to meet them where they are and find a place to present what you need to present. So keep that in mind. So, and if you're doing it outside on the back of the hood of the truck, understand wind's going to kick up, and that's always something to be dealt with. You'll learn that one quick. Earning trust and understanding. We've talked a lot about this. Listen to the farmer. Make eye contact. In 10 years, maybe we'll be texting back and forth as we're standing next to each other, but still, I think it's important to make eye contact. It does build trust. When they look at you and look into your eye and they understand what you're telling them, you have confidence in what you're saying, and an understanding that builds a lot of trust. certainly tailor advice, and show pictures of installed practices. We have some at the end of this presentation. I don't believe we'll get to them, but it's at least some examples for you to look at in the, down the road. So farmers do their research before making decisions typically. They really think through things. It's a nature of the business they're in. Provide good conservation recommendations to them. They'll think about it. And again, farmers elect to make the changes. It's not up to us to do it. They make the decisions, and we need to let them make the decisions. Again, they're the ones taking care of this, taking ownership after we're gone. And if it works, it's going to be because they're operating and maintaining it correctly. So let them make those decisions. And really, what makes people implement change, because change is hard, we all know that. Give them the information. They have to have some commitment to it. They have to be bought into those changes. Give sound advice. That's what we're here for, technical advice. Bring in your technical experts to have those conversations if you don't have that. Provide support, provide the resources. And then obviously, benefit of us working with the government, we have technical and financial assistance dollars, which is a big incentive, and that helps implement the change. Right. Manuel?
Communication is key in our job. Make sure you listen to the customers and make sure you plan with them and with your coworkers. Often, site visits are done by various NRCS employees, whether that is the planner, engineer, technician, specialist, and whatnot. Make sure everyone is on the same page. Next slide. Be willing to adjust. If you show up to a site visit and this is happening, it's probably not a good day, and it's probably a good point to just be nice with the farmer and tell them that we are going to come back some another day and just reschedule. On that same line of thought, also be open to change your tone almost constantly as you assess conversations with your coworkers and with the customers. Be willing to adjust will help your career, will make you a happy employee. It certainly has made me happy. Next slide. In some areas, haymaking season is not necessarily a good time for a site visit because the customers are busy at that time. Another example is for dairy farmers, early morning visits are probably not a good idea. Probably 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. Is a better time. That being said, make sure you're conscious about the kind of customers you're visiting and work around their schedule. Next slide. Often it's hard to implement change in a way that NRCS can based on standards and specifications because people keep doing the old ways or the ways Grandpa did it, or new ways that they found online. That on that line of thought, find ways and tone information, data, numbers to change the customer mind and try to sell a product that may be tough to them. Now, be conscious that this is their land, this is their property, and they will be the ones sticking with the practice for the life of the practice and beyond. So make sure that it's something that ultimately they want and they buy into it. Next slide. Also be conscious of decision makers. I mentioned this on the previous slide about the Amish. Often the person they are talking to is not the only decision maker, or the decisions will affect others. It may be grandparents, parents, spouses, partners, children. Just be mindful of all the possible decision makers and everyone that may be affected within the business and neighbors by the practices that you may be proposing and the customer may be implementing. And I pass to Darren.
Great, thanks, Manuel. So here, we're going to change gears again a little bit. This is going to talk a little bit about sort of what you're looking at when you're on a farm. So we're dealing with the farmer and the landowners, and now we're going to take a look around, and we may or may not be walking around with them, but assessing what's there. For instance, you look at this view and it appears everything looks really good. You know, it's a pretty clean area. Cows look good. Everything looks to be great. You go to the next slide and you say, oh, wait, there's a break in the concrete. Now we have a direct charge to the stream. And I think, this is something I want to just sort of talk about here a little bit, is that the landowners and farmers are customers, right? They are our customers. But so are the taxpayers. And as we build relationships with our farmers and landowners, we just talked about getting to know the grandparents and the next generation. And, we build these relationships because we want to work with them and build that trust. But we may start to feel a responsibility to help the farmers. That's our job, is to help them. Well, they may have financial troubles because they don't have, they don't set the price for their product. They may have problems with neighbors or regulators. They may have health issues. We're going to learn all that. And it's important to remember that our job is to help them address the resource issues on their farm, but it's through the use of taxpayers' dollars. So we have to do it, to benefit the resource issue. So fortunately for us, the work we do addresses those resource concerns. It usually helps the farmer in other areas, such as increasing production or improving neighbor relations. I believe a big benefit of our job is to be able to provide a win-win solution that addresses resource issues, that helps everybody, the greater good, while helping the farmer or landowner on the property. I mean, that's a win-win, and we get that almost all the time. However, on rare occasions, we can't do that. And it's important to be honest and have that honest conversation with the farmer. In this scenario, what you want doesn't address the resource issue that we need to address. We can't help you in this one. And they may not like that at the time, but they'll respect you for it. So keep that in mind. Always weigh that. We're helping landowners, but we're addressing resource concerns and using taxpayers' dollars to do it. And that's the job. So just wanted to kind of touch base on that a little bit more. Another example of that here, again, it might be an example of where the landowner thought they were doing great stuff. Hey, I got a walkway. I put in a culvert pipe. Maybe this is something we helped pay for, and now we're coming back and looking at it, and we're saying, oh, wait a minute, this was to exclude animals from the stream, provide a walkway. There's no fence on the other side. We really haven't addressed the resource issue. Or what about stream connectivity, right? Now, if we have any fish in this little channel or any other aquatic organisms, they're going to have a big leap to get up into that pipe. So there's definite issues there. So again, we don't want to install something, plan and install it, and again, not have it maintained. And we also, on the other side of it, is if they're trying to do good things, acknowledge that and then say, but we can do a little better here. So that's an example of this. Real briefly on biosecurity, put up this slide. It's sort of an agency slide. Know the farmer's expectations on biosecurity. Very critical, or can be critical for animal operations. Certainly dairies, chicken operations can be serious. If you're going to multiple farms in one day, and you're walking through barnyards and barns and manure, you can carry things from one farm to another. And you do not want to do something that's going to hurt somebody's, bring something onto the farm that's going to be a problem. So we have these rules and guides. Here's, more information on it. Ask what the farmer's policy is. I like that one. Avoid multiple visits if you can. Watch where you drive and walk, things like that. So keep an idea on biosecurity. Very important. Manuel, I'll turn it back over to you.
I want to close our presentation today with a note on farm safety. And farm safety can apply in many ways beyond biosecurity. We put engineering practices, and we need to be aware of the farmer safety, children safety, worker, and animals, especially around manure storage facilities, where almost every year we know about a farmer around the nation who had an accident around manure storage facilities due to manure gases and other inherent risk around those structures. Next slide. And we will conclude with this slide as we are at the time limit. In this case, this is an example where we see a manure pit, a concrete manure pit, which is fenced off. There's a sign for it. But I've seen similar manure pits that have a gate and no fence. We would hopefully not be paying or doing something like that, but sometimes we need to think outside the box and or just do things that make sense and just comply with local authorities and make sure the customer and the contractor does too. Stay safe, be safe, and make sure that you have safety in mind when you plan and design engineering, well, not just engineering practices, but all practices. Thank you.
Very good. Yeah. So, folks, that's where we're going to stop today. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it. Again, there are several slides in the back of this presentation that are before and after slides of practices. Just for your, again, it's a reference to things that may be very beneficial when you're talking with landowners. Do give those types of examples. And with that, we'll turn it back over, and I will stop sharing. And is it Nancy? Or are we on? I don't know who's up next. Happy to take questions if there's some out there.
Okay, so the last thing I wanted to ask you all is if there were any questions on this. Darren, could you please read them since I'm presenting, I can't see the chat screen?
Sure. Let's see, I want to make sure I'm on the right. Thank you. Just a lot of thank yous right now. This was a really great training. Thank you, coordinators, moderators, and presenters. So a lot of, yes, that's where.
Okay,
no questions at
so if there's no questions, this concludes the Northeast Regional Virtual Basic Boot Camp. I want to thank you for spending the last 4 mornings with us, and I hope you learned a lot and enjoyed the training.